Good evening and welcome to City Focus. I'm Marty Olsen, your host, and tonight I'm absolutely delighted to welcome an old friend who I've known basically my entire life. We go back, I think, to kindergarten or first grade, but it's one of the other at Harbor School.
It's a long way back.
and right through high school, classmates, and we just celebrated our 50th reunion about a month ago. Over at Langley's in Waterford, and to welcome him back to the program as well. I think this is your third appearance.
It is.
Carl SCHUMAN, better known in the legal circles as Your Honor, a Judge Carl SCHUMAN. But Carl, thanks for coming down.
Well, Marty, thanks so much for inviting me. It's kind of frightening to realize that it's been 50 years since we graduated high school. Time has flown, but I'm so happy that we're still friends.
Oh gosh, yes, and we do make an effort to get together from time to time, and it's always a pleasure. Usually over sporting events.
We don't always root for the same teams.
Well, that's true, and that's okay.
That's okay.
I wish we could do that in Washington. We could, in Hartford, for that matter.
You all have to learn how to disagree civilly.
That's an important consideration. I think we've lost that, especially at the national level, and we need to tone down the discourse and try to solve problems.
I agree.
But it's really, and I'd also like to just point out too, folks, those of you who may not know, but the year that I served as mayor of New London, I asked Carl to come down from the Hartford area to swear me in, and he did that, and I can't tell you how much that meant to me, that have a longtime friend come down and tackle that chore. I hate to use the word chore, but it was not. It was really. I was flattered and honored that you would do that.
It was really my honor. I do recall making some remarks, and I said that Marty Olsen is kinder and gentler than he was in high school, and he was kind of a rough, tough guy, but he settled down and honorably served the city of New London as mayor.
Well, thank you. And as Carl noted, we have recently had our class reunion, and one thing that I thought was fabulous is that you and a number of other classmates put together kind of an impromptu band and played for the class. So who else played in the band, and who motivated this, and how much practicing did you guys do before you played the show?
Yeah, this was really the work of our classmate Lance Reiser, who got the idea and who recruited musicians, took some out of mothballs, and put together this band. And then we actually practiced for about a year before the reunion.
Oh, really? I didn't realize you put that much time into it.
Yeah, maybe it didn't show, but it took a while to get the right personnel together and to agree on songs and to try to get the band tight and play together. So we also had Steve Mednick on drums, and he was one who kind of came out of mothballs. Peter Avard, you may remember, was a very talented musician and student. But
lives more as a student.
Perhaps I remember as both. He lives in the Boston area. He came down for rehearsals once a month. Long trip for him. Bob Bradshaw is a local guy who has a local group here in the area. Excellent bass player. And our classmate Nancy Caposa Patty lent some class to the group with her very strong vocals and backup on percussion instruments, and also Karen Edgar, whose maiden name I believe was Ahmedi, yes. So it was really great to get together, play music. None of us is quitting our day jobs to do this, but we had a lot of fun at the reunion. I might add, it was a very friendly audience, which always helps.
Well, it was fun. I thought you guys were terrific, and if there was anything that was challenging, was that because you were playing, you couldn't schmooze. So you did your business, and toward the end of the evening, you guys were able to get a little something to eat. And
I tried to catch up on schmoozing then.
Yep. So that was terrific. But and thank you to all of the group that pulled it together. I think it was terrific. But one of the reasons I enjoy having you come down and on the program is to discuss the law. And has things settled down with now that COVID is semi under control? That are you back in a routine of have the courts caught up, or are you still trying to catch up?
Yeah, though there are several questions, they have different answers. But first, let me just make clear that any views I express here are those of my own and not of the Connecticut Judicial Branch. But in some ways, things are back to the routine because we're in court, in person, on the criminal side. On the civil side, we've kind of drawn a silver lining from the pandemic, and we're using the virtual technology a lot more, and it's very helpful and productive because lawyers don't necessarily have to travel long distances to court, bill their clients, pay for parking, wait. Instead, they can stay in their offices and appear through Microsoft Teams or a Zoom-type platform. So in some senses, we're back to normal. It's the new normal, but there is also a very big backlog, particularly on the criminal side. I'm now sitting on the criminal side in Hartford. We have 100 murder cases on the trial list, and it's a daunting task. And a lot of that list.
That's all on for you, or
not
is that,
for me
how many,
personally.
are there other judges
Yes,
that handle these cases as well?
We have 4 trial judges in Hartford, but a lot of these cases just didn't move during the pandemic. They just backed up. Unfortunately, people were in jail waiting for trial, and we now have to try to chip away at that backlog.
Well, it seems like you'll have your work cut out for you. You won't be able to retire. You'll have to.
Well, I wish that were completely true, but truth be told, I'm 68 2/3, and you're not much younger.
I think a month.
Okay. And we have what we call mandatory semi-retirement at age 70 as Connecticut state judges. And so that means that we cannot try jury cases or preside over jury cases unless both sides consent, and that's unusual. We can do other duties as what we call a judge trial referee, but as a full-time Superior Court judge, I have only a year and a third left.
Yeah, well, some of your colleagues, Emmett Cosgrove and Lee Colchu, have both. Lee I know is retired. I think
Yes.
Emmett, if he hasn't, he's on the cusp. And I remember when Bobby Martin retired, and he's now passed away.
Yes,
but
yes.
It's interesting. The older I've gotten, I'm knowing more judges here. That,
Well, I hope you're staying out of trouble, Marty.
well, at a more pleasant level, yes.
Good, good.
The only judge I've been before was Judge Hendel, I think.
Well, he was kind of a tall figure in the New London courthouse community.
That's correct. Now, one of the big national cases it's been in the news and still is, and it seems it's going to maybe be a driver in the upcoming midterm elections, is Roe v. Wade,
Right.
which the current Supreme Court has overturned.
Correct.
Perhaps you could offer some light in terms of how that affects Connecticut specifically, since you work here,
Right.
but also how it nationally as well, because I think there's a lot of misunderstanding with this case that it's yay or nay, and I don't think it's quite that black and white.
Okay. So you're right. Big case, probably the biggest case decided last term, and in the last couple of years was a case called Dobbs v. Mississippi Center for Women or Health, something along those lines. And in that case, a 5-justice majority with the Chief Justice concurring, decided that Roe v. Wade was wrongly decided. That was kind of the first part of their decision. And second, that it should be overruled. And those two parts don't necessarily always go together. Court is generally supposed to adhere to what's called stare decisis. It's a Latin phrase which means, I think, stand by the decision. And generally, courts are supposed to stand by decisions whether they agree with them or not, whether the composition of the court is the same or not. And that's so that there's certainty and predictability and order in the law. It would be a bad thing if you could go into court and say, oh, well, the decision you reached last year was wrong. I think you should reverse it. And the court would do so just because it didn't like it. But
isn't the court a place where if you have had a bad law, it's an opportunity to, I mean, let's take Dred Scott.
Right.
Was that a good decision?
No, obviously not. Terrible.
So, I mean, it would be appropriate to overrule that.
Yeah. So I'm not suggesting that cases should never be overruled, but there's a balance that should be struck. And one, the case should clearly have been wrongly decided, and two, it should not, overruling the decision should not be just because there's a different composition of the court, or it should not affect people's reliance on the old decision. If people justifiably relied on the old decision in making their plans or in planning their lifestyles, and that was the case with Roe v. Wade, then that's a factor weighing against overruling it. But I do want to get to your question of its effect on Connecticut and elsewhere. In Connecticut, the overruling of Roe v. Wade has virtually no effect because states are allowed to confer greater rights on their citizens than the minimum required by federal law or by the U.S. Supreme Court. And so the state of Connecticut and any other state is allowed to confer on women the right to an abortion with or without condition or up to a certain number of weeks, even if the U.S. Supreme Court no longer recognizes a federal right. The states are allowed to confer state rights, and Connecticut has done so. And under Connecticut state law, a woman has a right to have an abortion, generally speaking, up through viability of the fetus. And what that means is often debated, but that is what the law says, through viability. And other states have done similarly, and other states are now free under the Dobbs decision to prohibit or limit abortion, with perhaps the exception of the mother's life being in danger, or rape and incest. Those are kind of gray areas.
Mm-hmm. So, in essence, then, abortion has not been by the Supreme Court been made illegal.
Right.
It's been turned over to the states.
Right.
It's an individual. All 50 states can now make their own rules.
Right.
Or have made their own rules.
Right. And the way you phrase it is very good, and it raises an important distinction. The Supreme Court did not say that abortion is illegal. They would have a hard time doing so, but if they did say that, then Connecticut could not make it legal. But what they did say is that there's just no federal constitutional right to an abortion. And states, as I say, have the ability to confer greater rights on their citizens than that required by the federal Constitution or the U.S. Supreme Court. Some states have chosen to do so, some have not. It's very much a political issue that may come up during the elections, but I'm not here to talk about politics.
No, and I didn't ask you to come down here to discuss politics.
Thank you, because I can't.
We'll talk about the law.
Good.
Offline, we can talk politics,
Fine.
perhaps.
Be happy to.
Also, and I don't glean that this is happening so much in Connecticut, but in some of our larger urban areas, there seems to be a revolving door or a lack of order where the district attorneys or attorney generals in different states are allowing, from my perspective anyway, a high degree of crime, breaking and entering and looting stores and things of this nature, with no repercussions. And like I say, I don't see this necessarily happening in Connecticut. At least it's not in the news. But is this a healthy environment? I mean, in terms of bail and arrest and things of this nature. Maybe I'm trying to phrase it properly here, but it's rather frightening what I'm observing.
Well, there's a lot of things to unpack here. First, just following the news, I wouldn't say that some of these district attorneys, so-called progressive district attorneys who are taking a lenient approach, have done so without repercussion, because as you may recall, the San Francisco district attorney was recalled in an election there.
Yes, when I say repercussion, I mean in terms of the folks that are promulgating the crimes.
Yeah, okay.
When you can run in and damage someone's store and damage their livelihood and nothing happens.
And I think this is happening particularly in states that have elected district attorneys.
Okay.
But in Connecticut, I don't think we have as lenient an attitude towards crime, and not coincidentally, we don't have elected district attorneys.
Or judges.
Or judges, right. And we have appointed state's attorneys and appointed judges. And although our dockets are overwhelmed with cases, and at times people do get lenient deals, I don't think that we're giving away the courthouse on a regular basis. Now, you also mentioned bail and arrest, and if you like, I can
Sure, absolutely.
Comment on that. It is true that some people who get arrested for serious crimes do make bail in the state courts.
You say state courts, you mean our courts?
Yes, our Connecticut courts, as opposed to the federal courts, which have a different system, and I can address that
Sure.
If you like, but just addressing the state courts where I sit. Except in capital cases, people who are arrested have a right to bail. Now, it's one of the more difficult decisions that we have to make as judges to set the amount of bail. And we consider a variety of factors: person's criminal record, how serious was the offense, how likely is it that the person will show up for court, how likely is it that the person will endanger someone else or commit another crime. And we have to make the best decision that we can. But we don't have crystal balls. And sometimes we set bail, person makes bail and commits another crime. Very unfortunate result. Other times I do think that we probably set bail and a person is unable to make it, and that person may not have committed the crime or may not have committed the crime that was charged. So we're very imperfect and very human, and we can make mistakes in setting bail, but we just try to consider the factors and make the best decision that we can.
Well, I hate to paint with a too broad a brush.
Okay.
But outside of Connecticut, where some of the issues that we see in the news, Again, it seems to be primarily in larger urban areas, and as you noted, perhaps maybe progressive states, where there seems to be, primarily after the Floyd incident, things seem to have exacerbated, that we're losing control of our urban centers. And what can be done to slow this down? I mean, get law and order, for lack, back in business, where you should feel comfortable in your safety of your home or your business and your community, and where the criminal element is not running roughshod.
Right. Well, there was a lot of violence, particularly after the George Floyd incident, and there was, particularly in some of the cities, the Midwest and the Northwest, maybe the West Coast. I don't think we saw that in Connecticut.
No, that's why I say I don't
Right.
think the Connecticut we saw that, but
Right. And I don't really have a solution for that sort of problem that's easy to implement, but I do think that serious crime should be prosecuted seriously, and judges should consider the harm to victims whenever there's a sentence to be imposed. We also have to consider mitigating circumstances and try to balance them. Sentencing is a very tough decision, but it's a prosecutor's job to enforce the law. Prosecutor does have some discretion, but generally speaking, the more serious the crime, the more it calls for vigorous prosecution. And if a person is found guilty, a judge has to impose a punishment that fits the crime. That may not be happening as much in other states, but I think it's happening in Connecticut. I think we have a fair criminal justice system here. And then if state courts are not functioning adequately, there is frequently federal court jurisdiction to prosecute serious crimes. Not always, but frequently. And you have seen the feds step in on a number of occasions. And I might add, because I referred to this earlier, the feds have a very different bail system, one that some states have considered. It's called preventive detention. And basically it comes down to this. If you should not be released prior to trial because you're dangerous or a flight risk, then they don't set a bail that you can make or a bond that you can make. If you should be released, then they'll set a bond that you can make. And in some ways, all that might be harsh. It might be fairer than Connecticut's system, because I'll give you an example.
Sure.
In a murder case in Connecticut state court, bail is typically at least $1 million. Sometimes it's more. If it's a double homicide or defendant has a record, it really starts at $1 million. Now, there are not too many people who can post $1 million bail. You have to hire a bail bondsman or post at least 10% in cash if the court allows it, or post real
That's
estate.
significant in and of itself.
Yes.
How many people walk around with $100,000 in their pocket?
No, very few people can, but there are some. You may recall a case like Michael Skakel,
Yes.
who was not related to the Kennedys, but was married to the Kennedy family, a wealthy, at the time, young man in the lower Fairfield County area. Some persons can post $1 million bail. And it's really, in some ways, an unfair system if you can get out of jail because you have the means to do so, the money and the wealth, and you can't if you don't have the means. And the federal system eliminates that and just makes the question of whether you should be detained based on how dangerous you are and not your resources. So there are other systems than Connecticut that we could consider.
That's very, very, very interesting. And you alluded to, too, in terms of the federal courts and the role, because they're handling different cases as well within the state of Connecticut, and
Yes, they
every
are.
state for that matter.
Correct. So every state has at least one U.S. attorney. 25 years ago, before I became a judge, I was an assistant U.S. attorney in the District of Connecticut.
That was Stan Torty, was he?
He was. He was a fine U.S. attorney. I worked for him and others for better part of 9 years. Some states have more than one district. Connecticut has one district, but in New York you have what's called the Southern District, the Eastern District, the Western and the Northern District. And the U.S. attorney, their U.S. attorney is appointed, nominated by the President with the confirmation of the Senate for each of these. There are 94 districts, I believe, in the United States, and they have authority to prosecute federal crimes. Now, some federal crimes are very unlike state crimes. So, for example, immigration violations, customs violations, antitrust violations, federal income tax violations are not really equivalent to any state crimes. But there are some federal crimes that are similar to state crimes, like bank robbery or kidnapping across state lines, or
So kidnapping within state lines is a state crime,
Right.
and then it becomes a federal crime if you cross state lines.
right, right. But sometimes the state will prosecute that because it occurred at least in part within the state. Sometimes the feds will prosecute that. Possession of a firearm by a convicted felon is a federal crime, and it's also a state crime. And generally speaking, the state prosecutors work out with the federal prosecutors, the assistant U.S. attorneys, who handles the case. And generally speaking, only one jurisdiction prosecutes the case. Occasionally, if there's an acquittal or what the feds consider an unjust result in state court, the federal prosecutors will also prosecute. And that happened, I believe, in the Georgia case, in which it was kind of racially motivated killing that the defendants claimed was a citizen's arrest. I believe both the state and the federal courts or jurisdictions prosecute. It doesn't happen often, but it occasionally happens.
Yeah, that's interesting. I would think that it would be one or the other,
Right.
and that
Right.
at least based upon television drama like Law and Order, it seems like the feds seem to always flex their muscles as they deem appropriate.
Well, ultimately, they have more muscle and probably can flex it a little tougher. But I thought you were going to mention the show Jeopardy and kind of transition it to double jeopardy, because there is a double jeopardy protection in the U.S. Constitution, but that only prohibits a sovereign from prosecuting twice. The federal government and the state governments are separate sovereigns. And so, as a matter of constitutional law, the fact that the state has prosecuted does not prohibit the federal government from prosecuting, and vice versa. But generally, they try to work it out and agree so that there's only one prosecution.
Thank God.
It's a little complicated, but that's what we do in court.
One of the things that we mentioned George Floyd a little bit earlier is the issue of police misconduct. And I mean, is this in fact a national problem here, or is it something that has been overblown for political gain, or some combination thereof? I mean, what's your take on things?
Okay, I'm glad you asked that, because that's a very important issue that we talk about a lot and are very concerned about. Clearly, there are some bad apples in the police departments, and there are people who don't belong in every profession. There have been some judges who've gotten into trouble and who've made bad mistakes. So we're all human. Every occupation has some who don't belong there. And clearly in the George Floyd case, I think Officer Chauvin did not belong and certainly did not act properly as policeman. But we are seeing more of this. I won't comment on whether it's a political motivation, but I will say there is one technological change that brings a lot of this to our attention, and that's that police are wearing body cams. And people have cell phones and are videotaping this, and there are surveillance cameras everywhere. So there's just a lot more that we're seeing on camera and on TV. I'd like to think that that police conduct has progressed over the years and that there's actually less of it than, say, in the 1960s when we were teenagers and we saw police beating people with batons during demonstrations. I'd like to think that police conduct has improved, but occasionally there are bad apples who make mistakes, and when that happens, we see it on TV because of body cams.
Yeah, well, I would think too that the cams would also exonerate the police.
Yes.
When they're actually doing their job right and they're being falsely accused.
Body cams have really been a two-edged sword. I think that they were originally proposed by groups that seek reform in the criminal justice system, like the ACLU, Civil Liberties Union, but I've seen a lot of body cam footage in court, and you're right, Marty, that 9 times out of 10 at least, it tends to dispel a claim that a defendant makes that, say, he wasn't given his Miranda rights, or the police were overbearing in interrogating or interviewing him.
Roughed them up?
Yeah, or roughed him up. And the body cams, I think, create a lot of work, but I think really have been something that the police have come to favor, because it shows that by and large they're doing a good job. So the body cams have been a two-edged sword. But I'd like to just, if I may, just
Sure.
a few more comments on police misconduct, because it does happen. But one thing that I think distinguishes our country from many others is that when, unfortunately, there is police misconduct, citizens have remedies. And there are a variety of remedies that citizens have. One, in the criminal case, they may be able to exclude evidence that was seized as a result of police misconduct. That's a complicated question, but sometimes they have that remedy. Unfortunately, in the George Floyd case, George Floyd did not live to use any of these remedies, but a victim of police misconduct or his survivors can bring a civil suit against police officers. It's difficult to do, but the courts are open to it. Sometimes there are criminal prosecutions of police officers because of police misconduct. And that's what happened in Minnesota. And I believe both the state and the federal government prosecuted, a rare instance in which they both prosecuted. And police departments themselves generally take disciplinary action against police officers when
larger departments have their internal affairs.
Right. You've heard officers are immediately suspended and occasionally fired virtually on the spot because of police misconduct. Now, it's not a good thing when police misconduct occurs, but citizens do have remedies that they don't necessarily have in other countries, and hopefully these remedies will serve as a deterrent to police from making those sort of mistakes.
Yeah. Well, I mean, you're bringing up other countries. I mean, I think that it's, as an aside, I mean, because it's certainly not Connecticut, but for those who do travel, that you need to be cognizant of where you are,
Yeah.
and that you're not in America, and you may not enjoy the same rights and privileges that you have here, there. And with a rather high-profile case of the basketball player.
I was just thinking of that myself, yes. So.
I mean, when we were growing up, I mean, Midnight Express was the kind of the case. There, the young man in Turkey who was ready to get on a plane, and he ended up in prison for a while, and it was a pretty scary experience.
Right, and so for Ms. Greiner, I think that's her name.
Yeah.
To be sentenced to 9 years in Russia for bringing in what claimed to be some sort of THC or marijuana component in a small amount, I think, seems to be a very harsh sentence, and hopefully something will be done about that.
Well, but not being aware. I mean, that's the thing.
Right.
I mean, when you're in another place, they don't necessarily play by our rules.
No, you have to play by their rules.
And I mean, we can jump up and down, but it may or may not be effective. I
would
remember, was it in Singapore? Was it an American who got caned for doing something, but we may look at as being silly? I don't know, spitting in the sidewalk or something. I mean, that was, I don't know, 10 plus years ago or so.
Okay, your memory is better than mine. I don't remember that, but that's something that
pretty severe punishment for.
Could not happen in the United States.
Correct.
It would clearly be cruel and unusual punishment prohibited by the Constitution.
Yeah. So, but just when you brought up, other places, I mean, you got to be aware, and not take for granted the things that we have here, and that's some of the kind of the dynamite that seems to be exploding around us here with current events. Sometimes I think we need to settle down a little bit and try to solve problems here. We're going off in different directions. One thing that is always, I think, on a lot of folks' minds is juvenile crime, and where do you draw the line between being a child and an adult, and how do you deal with these? I mean, I don't know if you've had a chance to work, juvenile court or not, but perhaps you could expound on that a little bit.
Yeah, I sat in juvenile court a long time ago, but I'm familiar generally with how they operate. So to begin with, Connecticut raised the age for juvenile court from 16 to 18 about 10 years ago. And so 16 and 17-year-olds who commit crimes start out in juvenile court. I think if you're 15 and over and you commit a Class A felony, which would include murder or arson or I think sexual assault, that would be automatically transferred to adult court and prosecuted there. But for most other crimes, they generally stay in juvenile court. Now, there have been a lot of cases in the news of juveniles stealing cars. It may seem like there is kind of that cycle where, that revolving door where juveniles are being arrested, coming into court, then being released, and then going out and maybe stealing more cars. And it has been a problem. I would say the first thing for all citizens to know is don't leave your keys or your fob in your car, because a lot of these cars are stolen because of that. But putting that aside, we do face a challenge with this sort of case. We used to have, for serious juvenile offenders, a reformatory or reform school in Middletown, the Long Lane Reform School, and that was closed for a variety of reasons. The administration has promised to make an equivalent available. It hasn't happened yet, but generally one of the challenges that we face in juvenile court is for the most serious offenders, the repeat offenders, we don't really have a place to put them where we can help them rehabilitate. The purpose of confining them or detaining them would not be punishment for a juvenile would be rehabilitation. But sometimes some young repeat offenders need to be removed from society and the temptations of society in order for rehabilitation to work. We don't have the best facility for that. And I'll just mention one other thing that I think might resonate with some of the work you've done, is that a lot of the cases in which I've seen juveniles commit crimes, unfortunately, are kids who don't have a father figure in the home. And so they get involved with other young adults, particularly males, who they look at as role models and are misled and get involved in drugs, gangs, and guns, and just get misled in a wrong direction. And it's hard to get kids out of that cycle. I'm not a sociologist or a social worker. I don't have the solutions to that. I know you've worked with young kids in high school who need mentoring and tutoring, and I think that is a good way to try to get kids who might have be in a difficult one-parent family to stay on the straight and narrow.
Yeah. I mean, one problem that New London is experiencing, and I don't know if it's statewide or if it's just an urban issue, is especially in the summer months, we've got young people who are utilizing dirt bikes and riding around the community on doing wheelies and irresponsible use of their motor vehicle. And the police have been directed, in essence, to not chase them, because if they do and these kids get into an accident, the city's liable, which is kind of hard to wrap my head around. But these kids will come in, they'll go down the wrong way, the one-way streets the wrong way, they're in and out of traffic, they're terrorizing motorists, noise. It's obnoxious, to be polite. And I don't know if there's a cure for that. I mean, maybe, I don't know, any case you've had regarding that, or anything at all.
Yeah. So I don't think I've had a case specifically dealing with that. I have seen these bikes on the street, and I agree it's annoying and noisy and interferes with the lawful movement of cars and pedestrians on the street. And I think the police have to just develop methods to enforce the law in this without getting involved in high-speed chases, because high-speed chases are dangerous. And police departments now have changed their policy on high-speed chases so that they won't engage in high-speed chase for anything but the most serious offenses or offenders. Because it's true, they may get sued, but more important is that some innocent person might get hurt, either from the offender or from the police as a result of a high-speed chase.
Yeah, that's it's a very, very challenging situation.
It is.
I mean, for the law-abiding citizens, why do we have to put up with this stuff? It's difficult. A couple of weeks ago, I had Mike DeMauro on the program. He's a local sports columnist, and a topic that he brought up, which I'd kind of like just get your thoughts on, and that has to do with the trickle down of athletes being paid. Now, college athletes are now able to derive income for, I guess, their likeness and
name, image, likeness.
And apparently, this is trickling down to the high school level. At least in Connecticut, the CIAC is allowing this, and I'm just flabbergasted by that. I don't know if that's prudent or if it's something that ought to be challenged. I don't know. But it worries me that these young folks are getting in a little bit over their head, a little bit too fast.
Mm-hmm. I'm not an expert on this area of the law, but I think part of the legal background behind allowing college athletes, at least, to benefit financially from their name, image, likeness, is that this is their reputation and their presumably good deeds that have earned them a following. And just like any other person who earns a living because he or she does a good job and word of mouth spreads, it might be hard to say that an athlete shouldn't be able to do that because he or she is a good athlete. So I think it's kind of an intellectual property type notion that his or her reputation is something that he or she has earned and should benefit from rather than the college.
Yeah. Now, if I'm not mistaken, this was settled in court. I mean, this is not by statute. Am I correct on that?
It may be in some states. I'm not sure.
I mean, and the reason I ask that is that, I would say that, a scholarship or a full scholarship has value. It's not like they're not getting nothing. You're getting an education. And in today's day and age, that could be worth $250,000.
It can, and I don't know exactly how this works, but I would hope that if a star athlete earns a lot of money through his name, image, or likeness, that would be something he or she would disclose in terms of eligibility for financial aid. I would think a college, you know how competitive college sports are, particularly in football and basketball, and colleges might decide to give an athletic scholarship even if a person can afford college, just to try to attract an athlete. But state schools might not be allowed to do that, and I would hope that all schools would try to reserve their scholarship money for those who truly need it.
Yeah. Well, but in regards to my discussion with Mr. DeMoro, I mean, at the high school level, I mean, the thought of, the other schools for recruiting, we've got a sponsor over here who's willing to pay you X amount of dollars or whatever it may be to attend this school. Is this a healthy environment? Is this is this something that can just be dealt with at that level, or is this something that the courts ought to look at?
Well, I was not familiar with the fact that this is going on at the high school level.
This is new.
Okay. All right. Well,
we're charting new ground here from what I'm gleaning from Mr. DeMoro, and well, it's a little, like I say, it's. I think with magnet schools and charter schools, there's enough recruiting going on without throwing the element of money payment.
Yeah. So as usual, Marty, you're on the cutting edge of the news. I was not aware of this, but I will just say that for kids in high school who are generally under 18, they're still minors under the law, and their parents would, I think, have to consent to any sort of commercial deal that student enters into. So
well, that may be
we might see some of this in court.
Yeah. I mean, it just worries that, it starts to get into high school and then into middle school, junior high school. I mean, there's, where does it stop? I mean, and the irony of it is a lot of the good athletes, when they're young, are the early ones who, I mean, I was a big kid.
You were.
But, quite frankly, over the course of time, just about everybody's caught up. But for a period there, I held an advantage, being like grew earlier, as did my brother. Right. And where do that advantage was good at a particular point in time, but athletically, but it didn't last forever. I mean, when I got out of high school, Ohio State was not recruiting 180-pound guards.
Unfortunately for you, no. Right. I would say that this is probably a matter for the state legislature to consider. We'll deal with any cases that come into court, but it sounds to me like there should be some state policy on this.
Yeah. Well, it's always as the world and the state and the city turns. And I always love having you come down and sharing an hour here on the set and sharing your thoughts and views on what's going on. And we're down to our last moments here. Is there anything that you'd like to offer in closing remarks that maybe we haven't touched on?
Well, I'll just say that I am in court trying jury cases, and one of the most rewarding aspects of it is working with jurors. They're ordinary citizens of all backgrounds, but they believe in their civic duty to appear for jury duty, and it's great working with citizens like that, and they generally feel that it was a rewarding experience and that they were glad that they had done so, even though their friends might be saying you should try to get out of it. They, generally speaking, are glad that they had served. So I want to encourage all our listeners to do some jury service. I don't think you'll regret it.
Well, I would concur. I've been called for jury duty, but have never had a trial.
Well, now we've extended the age to 75, Marty, so you have more chances.
Thank you.
Marty, thanks so much for inviting me.
Folks, you've been watching City Focus. We'll see you next week. Good night.